I'd like to welcome Madeline Lohman from the Advocate for Human Rights. She's going to be presenting to us today on the labor trafficking protocol guidelines. So if you wouldn't mind giving her a warm welcome.
Thank you, everyone. Is this on? Thank you, everyone.
Red button.
Red button? Oh. Just hold it for a second. Lights up. There. Now are we on? Yes. Okay. Yeah, thank you all for coming. I'm going to be here talking about the labor trafficking protocol guidelines. They are not protocols because we do not yet have a system in Minnesota where we can really firmly tell you exactly who to call when. Instead, we have guidelines because every community needs to think about what resources they have to support labor trafficking victims and what they're going to have to collaborate across communities, regionally or statewide, to meet people's needs. So this is just walking through the kinds of things that labor trafficking victims need in their response to help people plan what their actual organizational or community protocols will be. So to create this, we did interviews with people all over the state and compiled them into the report. We analyzed best practices, both that people here in Minnesota were employing and from other states. And then I'm going to walk through a little bit of how to use these guidelines yourself. So first of all, this was, the bulk of this came from, first, a survey of basically everyone that we could get access to on what kinds of resources they were currently using, whether they were seeing labor trafficking victims, if they had training, if they had their own internal protocols to respond to labor trafficking victims. And then we followed up with 93 in-depth interviews and focus groups all over the state with people who either were working with high-risk populations or already were working with identified labor trafficking victims. And then we did a policy and legal analysis of what was currently available to people in Minnesota and whether there were any gaps. So one note about these guidelines is that the way this was done under the MDH grant to expand the safe harbor response to labor trafficked youth as well. And that grant had a dedicated tribal working group that was developing a tribal response. So we did not do a tribal response in these guidelines. This is something that is for non-tribal organizations because the tribes were creating their own response. So our recommendation is that if you work with Native victims or you are in a location where there are sovereign tribal entities around, that you should consult and coordinate with them to find out what their response is. And I think that's basically everyone in the state of Minnesota. So people should be interacting and talking with tribal agencies to figure out what the response should be in those situations. So how did we structure our report? First, we have a sort of background on labor trafficking. This is something that when we were doing our research, probably the biggest barrier to responding to labor trafficking is that most people don't know what it is, don't know what it looks like. So we start our guidelines with an explanation of what labor trafficking is and how it develops and what drives it, what are the factors that drive it. Then we have a universal section that is for anybody who might be interacting with labor trafficking victims. So groups that might work with really high-risk populations like immigrants, youth, people in poverty, people experiencing homelessness, people with intellectual and physical disabilities. All of those groups are really high risk for trafficking, so people working with those groups should know about this. Organizations that have seen trafficking victims because they're the kind of place that is one of the few places a trafficking victim's allowed to go. So medical settings, faith communities, schools are places where trafficking victims end up, even though they're in a trafficking situation. And then finally, organizations that could directly provide services to trafficking victims. So worker rights organizations, housing providers, mental health service providers, and anyone who is currently providing trafficking response probably should know what labor trafficking is and figure out how to respond. So the Universal Protocol is meant to apply to all of those groups and walks through the really key parts of a response. And I'll go through each of those sort of in order. And then finally, there's some really key sectors that are crucial to any effective response to trafficking. Law enforcement, prosecutors, housing providers, victim advocates, legal services, child protection, and healthcare. So we gave specific chapters to each of those to talk about the unique things that those sectors need to do. So first, we really wanted to ground this in sort of the underlying values that people talked about when working with labor trafficking victims. And it turned out that as people were talking, they were using the same kind of language and values that we use to guide, as a state, the response to sex trafficking victims. So people talked a lot about victim autonomy and being very clear on what information was confidential and what wasn't, giving victims agency over the choices that they were making, not treating them as criminals. So one factor of labor trafficking is that victims can be made to commit criminal acts. So it might seem that unlike sex trafficking, the labor trafficking victim wouldn't have interaction with the criminal justice system, but we do in fact see that victims have interaction with the criminal justice system, either because in addition to the legal work they're doing, the trafficker is making them commit crimes, or because the entire trafficking scheme involves illegal work. They're being forced to carry or sell drugs, they're being forced to participate in a theft ring. And so they may be interacting with law enforcement as criminal defendants, and so recognizing the trafficking part of that these are victims and not criminals. Or in a situation in which there is a trafficker and the victim hasn't committed criminal acts, but is, for instance, an undocumented immigrant, that they not be pressured to participate in the prosecution against their trafficker through threatening criminal or immigration consequences. That everyone should get comprehensive services based in trauma-informed care. Labor trafficking, like sex trafficking, is a highly traumatic human rights violation, and so making sure that they get help for that. And that we'd like to see those services offered statewide. So some of this is stuff that I think people are already really comfortable with incorporating when they're working with victims. Some of it might be a little bit new. Certainly some of it is not happening yet. We don't have statewide services in all the areas a labor trafficking victim might need. So there's things that we as a state could really grow. And then the last one, labor trafficking can be prevented. So we just heard that really lovely presentation about the different ways to prevent labor trafficking, and that's key. At the Advocates for Human Rights, we adopt a human rights approach, which is different than a public health approach, but very, very similar in that we really focus on changing the systems and the root causes of human rights violations like trafficking. So for us, prevention is a key part. And so we do talk in the protocol about prevention. And one of the key things we find is that we have really high-risk populations, and one of the things that makes them at risk is that they are marginalized and disconnected from organizations that could help them. They don't trust law enforcement, they don't trust government agencies, they don't know any of the service providers in their community, they don't speak the language of any of those service providers, and that disconnect is something that traffickers prey on. So who are those high-risk populations in any community, and who do they already trust? Because in some cases, they already have community institutions or community leaders that they trust to talk to, but those organizations and institutions may not have resources or capacity to do a response to labor trafficking. So how do we empower those trusted organizations to play a role in the response and help bring victims into the system? And this has to be done in a really fully collaborative partnership. Like, we can't sort of take from these groups and give nothing back. They have to be given resources, they have to be given funding so that they can play a really co-equal role in any response. So figuring out who those organizations are and helping them be an equal partner in everything that we do is really key. The sort of easiest low-hanging fruit of prevention is an outreach campaign similar to the one that they highlighted from New Orleans, where we're really raising awareness of what labor trafficking is, that it exists, so that people in those populations can start thinking, wait, this job offer is really too good to be true. Should I be looking for red flags? And starting to think about that. But then the next step, and the thing that really gets at the root causes of trafficking, is helping provide everyone in the state the ability to meet their basic needs. Trafficking is very often driven by the fact that the victims feel that they have no way to get housing, support for their families, protection from the dangers and risks that they face, and the trafficker has offered to meet those needs, and that has what got them into the trafficking situation. So we need to figure out a way for them to to get those needs met without being susceptible to traffickers. So what does that look like? We need to reframe our conversation away from, do you qualify for benefits, into, do you have a need, we will meet it. And that is sort of the key part of prevention. The other thing that's really important in a trafficking response is not just prevention, but also collaboration. So this is something that I think the Safe Harbor Network has been really conscious of looking at, moving from a one-time response where every case is sort of treated new every time it comes up, and the response is really ad hoc, and you sort of piece it together as you go, into developing really systematic methods of collaboration, where there's someone bringing people together from different sectors, talking about cases, talking about systems change, which is quite difficult but very worthwhile, and really investing in trying to make that ongoing network of talking about cases, talking about methods, and improving that. And we right now, in labor trafficking, are sort of hovering between one-on-one referrals and collaboration and multidisciplinary collaboration on a single case. And we really need to move up this sort of chart into the top one, where we're collaborating on systemic responses. So the idea behind the protocol guidelines is they're supposed to be a sort of catalyst for having those top-level conversations. And so an example of why we really think that that collaborative part is key is this case, and I don't know how many heard about it. It's a couple years old at this point. It was a nanny in Woodbury who was brought here from China, and once she arrived here was really significantly abused by her employer. Denied food and water, physically assaulted, not paid, had her identity documents confiscated. So she fled, was identified by local law enforcement as a trafficking victim, which was pretty awesome, that local law enforcement knew enough to say, this isn't just assault, something else is happening, and sort of brought her into the system. But what we found is that there wasn't an existing collaboration structure, and so there was a lot of miscommunication about her case. It ended up involving both federal and state law enforcement. There was a TVAP provider, there was a housing provider, there was a legal services provider, and the communication between those parts was not working. And it was compounded by the fact that the victim faced really significant language barriers. She spoke a dialect of Chinese that was quite hard to find. And the end result is that she was miserable, and instead of sort of fully taking advantage of her rights as a victim to get immigration status, to stay in the United States, to bring her family here, fairly early on decided that all she wanted was to go back to China. She didn't want to deal with anything else, and she felt trapped by her inability to do that, and it took months, like 6 months, for her to finally be able to go back to her family, during which time she felt isolated and unhappy pretty much the whole time. So experiencing that case made us realize we need guidance on what collaboration needs to look like, who, people need to decide who speaks with the victim, who negotiates and helps be the liaison between the victim and law enforcement, how does law enforcement coordinate so that they're making unified decisions, what does that look like? And so that was one of the driving sort of inspirations for the protocol guidelines, is trying to make sure this case doesn't happen again in that kind of way. So the first step towards a labor trafficking response is identification. This is the sort of big gap right now in Minnesota, is people not identifying labor trafficking. And when we think about identification, we tend to think of it in 3 or maybe 4 tiers, depending on how you define things. We have a sort of initial screening for indicators where you're identifying red flags. You're sort of thinking through, does this meet the sort of general broad definition of what trafficking is? If someone passes that screening, they go into an in-depth intake or assessment to determine whether they actually qualify for benefits under state or federal law, or whether their case could be a criminal or civil case under state or federal law. So they're getting a much more thorough investigation of what's happening. And then finally, you have a specialized screening that might be for their immigration benefits, where they're going to have additional questions beyond just, is this trafficking or not, that need to be administered by an actual immigration attorney. perhaps they're a minor and are very traumatized and they're going to need a forensic child specialist to do the interview. This is something where we actually have specialized people who are going to administer that screening. So most people just need to be doing the initial screening for indicators. The goal here is to make sure that the victim doesn't have to repeatedly disclose lots of detail about what's happened to them and re-traumatize them. And it also is a way for them to get connected with services as soon as possible, even if they aren't yet ready or able to share the full details of their experience. So that's sort of the goal of this very broad initial screening, and that's the one that most people should be conducting. If you are an organization that then might be someone providing trafficking victims services, and you want to be doing that, and so you think you need an in-depth intaker assessment, then please consult with us or MDH or DHS about what that kind of in-depth assessment would look like and how you would administer it. In good news, as Sarah mentioned, we are in the process of developing a statewide screening tool that will cover ambitiously sex and labor trafficking, sexual exploitation, labor exploitation, adults, and children. So when that comes out, if we are capable of putting that all into a single screening tool, we think so. We think we're on the right path. There will be a comprehensive guide to how you set up that protocol internally and what kinds of questions to ask and what kind of conversation to have with a victim and what you should be looking for in those conversations. So that will hopefully be out before the end of the year, right? I've forgotten our timeline. Early 2020. And so that is very promising. In the interim, we do have a little screening that I'll talk. We are going to have this screening tool is already available on our website. It was developed by a working group of members of the Human Trafficking Task Force a couple years ago. And it has 5 really basic questions that are just labor trafficking and are really adult directed. So this isn't as comprehensive as the one we're going to be developing, but it's something to start with. It was written to be something you could hand to a potential victim and they could take it with them, read the questions over, think about whether it applied to their situation, and then it gives the number of the National Human Trafficking Hotline so that even if they end up leaving Minnesota, they can still get access to services. But it can also be used to guide your own conversations with people and what you should be looking for and listening for. So we have managed to get it translated into 10 languages. You may be like, that's an odd collection of languages. It's whoever volunteered to translate the document for us. So if you have languages that you think should be up there but aren't, and you speak them, please let me know, because we would love to add to our collection. So what is really the importance of expanding identification. This is another case that sort of highlights a gap in the system. Again, in the paper a lot, this was a young man who was brought over from the Dominican Republic. His trafficker offered to bring him here so that he could go to high school in the United States. Spent 3 years cultivating his family and convincing them to send him to the United States. When he got here, enrolled him in school, but after a month or two said, actually, you need to work for me, because I am taking care of you. So he had to work in the restaurant and sleep in the basement of the restaurant and work on the man's house, got paid almost nothing. There was sexual assault involved. It was an extremely horrible case. He was in school the whole time, was falling asleep in his classes. No one ever asked what was happening. He was the one who said, I might be a trafficking victim, and Googled trafficking and figured out he was a trafficking victim and called the National Human Trafficking Hotline. That is extremely unusual that a victim would do that. It's really rare for a victim to self-identify in that way. Thank God he did, because otherwise no one noticed. And so that really shows how important it is for all sectors who might be interacting with victim populations to know at least the red flags of what might indicate labor trafficking, so that they can make sure someone asks questions and checks to see what's happening. So the next part, actually probably a conversation to have before you start screening people, is confidentiality. So labor trafficking victims, like sex trafficking victims, like many crime victims, really need to know what is confidential. There's things they do not want to disclose. They may have concerns about their immigration status, about family matters, about acts that the trafficker forced them to commit, shame about what's happened to them, things that they don't want disclosed, and they will rapidly lose trust in the system if they feel like that information was shared without their knowledge. So before talking to a victim and asking them questions, making it really clear what are the situations in which you have to share information, what are the situations in which you might want to share information but will be able to get the victim's permission, and when you will never share their information because you are someone like an attorney that has legally protected communications. So being really clear up in advance, and also knowing what are the confidentiality policies of any group you refer them to, or at least reminding them that if you make a referral, that group may have different confidentiality requirements so that they know to ask again about what would be shared and what wouldn't be shared. And finally, if you're providing services and you can provide them without forcing the victim to answer questions. I know sometimes you have eligibility requirements, they really need to tell you if they're 18 or 24. You know, that might have to happen. But if you can provide them the services without requiring answers, that is useful to the victims as well, because it means that they don't have to disclose something they might not want to. I have heard, I don't have like a handy news article about this one, but have heard anecdotally stories of victims feeling very upset because they ended up talking to someone that they assumed was operating under one level of confidentiality, and then it became clear that in fact they were operating under a different one and disclosed information when the victim didn't realize that was going to happen. Okay, so once you've identified a victim, what is the response that we need to provide? This is a little overwhelming graphic that contains basically everything that we need to think about. And so though it seems a little big, it is supposed to be what the entire community and state agencies and service providers are providing. No one group is going to be able to do all of these things. This is where that collaboration is really key. So we can see at the top, if you've encountered a labor trafficking victim, these are the things we need to think about right away. Are they safe? Are they safe when they leave? If something escalates with their trafficker, do they have a place to go that will keep them safe? If they exit, do they need help keeping their family safe or themselves safe ongoing? So asking them those questions. You know, there are obviously advocates and organizations that are really qualified in doing safety planning. So if you're an organization that doesn't know how to do safety planning, contacting one of them to help the victim or getting that training so that you can develop that expertise is really important. Figuring out if they have any special needs, and so what we're thinking about here is, are they a minor, are they a vulnerable adult, or are they a foreign national? Those are the three groups where we have really big concerns right away about the response. So we need to identify those groups. Do they have any immediate basic needs they need taken care of? Often in trafficking, housing is going to be your number one basic need that you need to address first. We obviously have a pretty significant shortage of emergency, transitional, affordable, every kind of housing in the world in Minnesota. So that can be really challenging, and there's not any dedicated housing for labor trafficking victims, which complicates the issue. So trying to figure that out for them on their behalf. They may also need food, cash assistance, transportation, language services, any of those things in that first assessment. And then if possible, contacting a victim advocate or one of the labor trafficking service providers who can be that expert and talk to the victim about what the process is and what they might go through. We don't have a specialized labor trafficking victim advocacy group in Minnesota. And so we don't have someone to fill that really key role of being that sort of social connection and accompaniment through the entire process. We have different service providers who are going to attach at different parts, but they can at least do some of the walking the victim through the process initially, the groups that we have. So then once you've done that really basic assessment, we need to come up with that short-term response. Do they want to talk to law enforcement is probably going to be one of the first questions that the victim's going to need to ask. They want to make an immediate report. And they may. We've definitely had victims who are like, I want to see the trafficker in jail. We have others who are like, no. So figuring that out, For minors and vulnerable adults, figuring out whether it needs to be a mandated report. Vulnerable adults, labor trafficking is a mandated report in Minnesota. So we need to make sure that if it's a vulnerable adult, you call into MARC, which is the vulnerable adult, the hotline for reporting abuse. For minors, follow the bulletin that we've just issued, which is to say labor trafficking is not a mandated report, but the child is a victim of a crime and so is eligible for child welfare services. So connecting them with that system can be really important. Then finding providers for those basic needs that they need met, making sure they have access to benefits. So they may be someone with irregular immigration status, they may not have an address, figuring out how they can get medical care and housing and the rest. And then finally, their long-term response. So victims under both federal and state law are entitled to criminal restitution at the end of a criminal case against a trafficker. They also can pursue civil cases against traffickers. So they, even if they don't make a report to law enforcement, they can sue their trafficker in court for labor trafficking under both federal and state law. They can also pursue other claims. Most labor trafficking victims are victims of wage theft, are victims of other kinds of employment law violations, and you can either bring those as individuals or you can contact them and point to Dave here, who's our representative from the State Department of Labor and Industry. You can contact the state or federal departments of labor to make those wage claims, and they can get that money back through that mechanism. Working on that collaboration structure, so now that you've found those providers, figuring out how you're all going to talk to each other. The reality is that at this point there probably is no pre-existing collaboration structure that you're going to be able to just jump right into, so forming that with the providers that you're contacting. What are the victim's long-term goals and how can we keep providing services? And then finally, ensuring family reunification. They may be a foreign national who's here to work and they don't have their family with them, and so they need to bring them over through the immigration system. They may be anyone, U.S. citizen, immigrant, who the trafficker has separated from their family and used their family against them. So sometimes we see traffickers threatening consequences about children. Your children will get taken away, or I already have your children, as a way to control their victim. So helping them pursue that family reunification through family law and custody issues. In the labor trafficking protocol guidelines, which I should have modeled at the very beginning, we have a checklist for working with labor trafficking victims that basically goes over the conversation you would have with victims as you were doing that immediate sort of planning of services and response. So things like, I've discussed culturally appropriate practices. I have talked about potential criminal justice responses. I know I've got a safety plan with the victim. And so all of these things are really the sort of first steps, and it just walks that through, because I think a lot of people don't necessarily know everything that they have to cover. So that's the idea behind the checklist. And that comes at the end of the sort of universal protocol. So hopefully by the time you get to the checklist, you know what all of these different things refer to, because they're all talked about in the main section. Then we really want to focus on special populations. So as I said, these are the three groups that we really want to make sure are identified as soon as possible. Victims under 18, vulnerable adults, and foreign-born victims. For victims under 18, one of the key things is to assume that someone is a minor unless proven otherwise. If they plausibly could be a minor, we're going to assume they're a minor until we find out otherwise, because traffickers often take people's identification documents, lie about people's ages, convince the victim to lie about their age. So we may not know the person's actual age. And there are so many benefits to being a minor that we want to make sure that they have that given to them until we know for sure how old they are. And one of the biggest ones, if they're a foreign national, is that access to the OTIP reporting process that Sarah mentioned. For vulnerable adults, there are mandated reports, so immediately involve the adult protection system. You may need to find specialized services, so the housing provider you might normally go to may not be able to house a vulnerable adult safely, and so is there another place to go? And maybe even knowing those in advance. And then finally, if you work with vulnerable adults, knowing how financial abuse, which is under our statute, can be linked to trafficking. So traffickers who are preying on vulnerable adults often do things like force them to sign over any disability checks that they have. So if you encounter a case where someone is financially abusing or exploiting a vulnerable adult, check if there are other elements in which the person is having to provide a service for that abuser, because then you might be looking at trafficking. And then finally, foreign-born victims. Unlike sex trafficking, the labor trafficking population is more heavily foreign-born. So we see more foreign national victims in labor trafficking. And here, the key things is pretty much as soon as possible involve an immigration attorney. Labor trafficking cases can be really complex, and immigration law is incredibly complex. So having an immigration attorney who can say, yes, you will qualify for a T visa, which is the special status for immigration victims, and knowing the information they have to collect, knowing how they need to make a law enforcement report, because that's required, can really help. It can also help, like, I'm both a trafficking victim and I've committed some crimes. What does that mean for my immigration status? Or walking through those different aspects. Figuring out if they're eligible for benefits, getting them language access, really key. And for anyone who isn't sure, involving the immigration attorney before contacting law enforcement agencies is really important, because contact with law enforcement agencies can lead to contact with immigration services. And immigration services, there are dedicated protections and pathways for investigating trafficking, but sometimes that identification won't necessarily be made right away. And having an immigration attorney can be the advocate to say, wait guys, put this person into an investigation, not into deportation proceedings. Can be really important. So what are the special considerations? You can get immigration status. The T visa is specifically for trafficking victims. Sometimes if you can't meet the definition of a T visa, you might still be eligible for a U visa, which is for victims of certain kinds of crimes of violence. It is not as good a visa as the T visa, so if you can get a T visa, that's better. And then continued presence is something that federal law enforcement can ask for immediately upon identifying a labor trafficking victim or a sex trafficking victim. They can say, we're investigating this case, or we think that this is a trafficking case. We need a temporary protection that lets the person stay in the United States for 2 years and then can be renewed. And they can pursue their T visa while they're under that temporary protection, but it gives them sort of a stability while their immigration case is being processed. And then case management. So foreign-born trafficking victims can get a case manager through the TVAP program, can get cash assistance, access to public benefits, work authorization. It's a really, really important set of benefits for victims, and so getting them connected with that right away is really important. And sometimes you can start talking to someone who is a TVAP case manager before you've done the sort of law enforcement reporting, and they can help give you a recommendation for how that can go. Or you can talk to an immigration attorney and they can make a recommendation for how that can go. So those direct service providers that Sarah had that map of, those are the best first step for handling these kinds of issues. So this is an example of the importance of those immigration benefits for victims. This was a case where a group of 30 plus Dominican farm workers were brought over from the Dominican Republic by labor brokers in Ohio. A farmer in Minnesota hired them for his farm, and then between the three of them, the labor brokers and the farmer, they forced the workers to pay kickbacks for all of the expenses that are supposed to be paid for by the employer under the visa program. So these were all people on legal visas, had all sorts of rules about the employer having to pay a certain wage and housing and transportation. But once the workers were here under their control, they said, you know, we don't actually believe we should have to pay all those things, so you have to pay us back out of all of your paychecks, all of those expenses. And if you don't, you will immediately be deported back to the Dominican Republic, and you'll never work in the United States again. And so using that threat of deportation to keep them quiet, and to keep them from complaining about their pay, it was eventually uncovered, and the victims were able to get help. The investigation they actually gave them continued presence and then closed the investigation, and then they were connected with an immigration attorney. Ideally, anyone here in law enforcement connect with the immigration attorney as the case is proceeding, not after the case is done, because it turned out that as this case was moving through the system, the time to get a T visa went from 1 year to 2 years. So every one of the victims that filed early got their visa in 1 year and was able to reunify with their family and start their lives. And the ones who filed just a couple months later had to wait 2 years. Their continued presence expired and was not renewed. And so they were living in limbo, unable to do anything until they finally got their T visas. And we just heard that they successfully got their last T visa like in the last week. So that was 14 months, I think, from the point that they filed their visa, which was several months after they had been discovered as victims, because we had waited so long to get them connected with an immigration attorney. So then the other really key part, and I think this is maybe one of the more challenging parts of labor trafficking cases, is that labor trafficking cases, there's a really close connection between the criminal activity that is labor trafficking and the civil activity that is violations of our labor and employment laws. And so victims can use both systems at the same time to get help. But those are systems that don't necessarily have a history of working together. So how do we make sure that there's coordination and talk and that people know what's moving first? And you also can do both of these things at both the federal and state level. So you have a lot of different agencies that can have moving parts. Some of them already work together really closely, like the state and federal departments of labor work together and are used to that. So that's a good connection. But how do we make sure that all of them are sort of working together well? And then there's ones where we really have not had a lot of sort of experience. So we don't have very many actually state labor trafficking criminal cases. The ones that are up here, these news articles, those are the 3 that we've ever had charged under state law. So a lot of local law enforcement may not be used to prosecuting those criminal cases. And then on the other hand, in the sort of civil and administrative realm, cities, municipalities often have rules governing businesses that could be used to address trafficking, and they don't have current practices to do that. So how do we get those systems aligned as well? So an example, I guess we have 4 now. All right, this is number 4. An example of this working was a group of undocumented workers who worked in the construction industry, and they were being trafficked by their labor broker, who operated as a subcontractor. You know, construction companies would hire him to come in and do just the roofing part of a job, and his workers happened to just be trafficking victims. So he would threaten to report them to immigration officials if they tried to complain. One of them got very seriously injured. He went to the hospital and forced his injured worker to say that he had been injured working on his own home rather than on a work site, so that he didn't have to pay workers' compensation. When that worker was then picked up by immigration, the trafficker bonded him out and then said, now you have to work for free because I paid your bond. And so was using sort of his control over the workers to really sort of pretty egregiously underpay them and not help them with their medical care. It was uncovered by a worker organizing group. And they connected with a state agency, they connected with labor trafficking, legal services, and all of that together ended up figuring out, okay, this is a trafficking case. There's these different things that are other kinds of crimes, like insurance fraud, but we also see labor trafficking. How do we get that? Talked to the prosecutors. The prosecutors said, okay, we need someone who can build a labor trafficking case, because we've never done that before. So the government agency built the labor trafficking case, and the prosecutors brought it forward. So here we have a civil and criminal agency sort of figuring out together how they were going to approach this case, and it took a lot of work on the part of advocates to keep it going, to say, you've got this case, you need to include labor trafficking. You've got labor trafficking, you need to get a prosecutor, and to bring that together. So that is one of the things that we need to see more of, is that connection. So then we have sector-specific chapters, as I mentioned, covering the really key ones in a labor trafficking response. So if you are law enforcement, you should both read the universal section and then the specific one that covers things like how do you house labor trafficking within your department, what are the key parts of a labor trafficking criminal investigation, questions like that get answered in the various sector chapters. And then we have implementation tools in addition to the checklists. We have 2 tools that help construct a community level protocol or an organization level protocol. So you'll notice the one thing that I can't do here is say, okay, first you get the screening tool from state agency A, and then when you've identified a trafficking victim, you call B number, and that B number will refer the trafficking victim to organizations C, D, E, F, and G. We don't have that. So we have to make that. So this is how you can make that. This is a list of all the kinds of services a labor trafficking victim might need. Know your own community and say, okay, I actually do know a great victim advocacy organization. I'm going to call them up, talk to them about whether they could handle a labor trafficking case, and if they can, or if they need some training, but then could do it. I'm going to put them down here, and they're going to be that part of our response. And it goes through all of them. So figuring out who needs training, are there gaps, either needs or populations that aren't served that need to be filled in maybe from someone outside the community, and who wants to be part of an ongoing collaborative response. Sometimes you have a service provider that's like, yes, refer me someone, I'll take care of them one-off, but this isn't really my mission, so I can't help develop a systemic response. But others will say, no, this is core, we need to make something as a community, and they should be part of that collaborative response. Similarly, law enforcement. Is there a local law enforcement agency that could play a role? What information do you know about how they operate? Talking to them about, do they have experience with labor trafficking? Do they want training? Do they need training? And identify what is their relationship with immigration. So in labor trafficking, when we see a foreign national victim, we need to know, if we call local law enforcement, how they handle information about immigration status. And so knowing, do they formally prohibit cooperation? Do they informally say, well, you know, we just don't share information about victims and witnesses, but if we find someone that we think is a perpetrator, we would definitely let immigration know? Or do they actually have a formal cooperation policy with immigration? And it's really important to ask this of all the different agencies that are involved in that geography. So in Minneapolis, for a very long time, the Minneapolis police have a formal policy about sharing immigration status, where they're not supposed to share immigration status about anybody. But when they pick someone up and put them in jail, it was Hennepin County Detention Center, and the sheriff had a policy of screening every foreign national and immediately notifying ICE that they had booked in a foreign national. So even though it appeared that people in Minneapolis had protection, they didn't, because simultaneously they were subject to this Hennepin County jurisdiction. So knowing how those things interplay is really important. And then do they want to be part of a collaborative response? So any questions? And I will say, over on the resource table, I have these little cards, and they have the link to the guidelines on our website. So please go download the guidelines and look through them and figure out how you as an agency or organization or community want to respond. All right. Everyone's ready. We're going to do it.
Thank you, Madeline.